More than 300 million years ago, the oceans were home to predators far more powerful than anything alive today. Some grew longer than a city bus, armed with jaws so deadly they never had to chew. One snap was all it took. Others were so enormous they needed the seas to be absolutely packed with food every single day, not just lucky hunts now and then. These giants weren't rare. For millions of years, they ruled the oceans completely, deciding what lived and what disappeared beneath them. And then they were gone, not slowly fading away, not pushed out by new rivals. They vanished and burst so fast, the fossil record barely caught a glimpse. And this didn't happen just once. There were moments when the oceans themselves changed. Vast stretches lost their oxygen. The underwater reefs that fed entire food chains began to crumble. The biggest predators had nowhere left to turn. Their enormous size demanded perfect, steady conditions. When those conditions broke, there was no backup plan. All that remains today are scattered fragments, a piece of heavy armor, a jaw that no longer fits anything living, teeth unlike any we see now. Each one is a quiet reminder of an ocean that once made the impossible possible. But what kind of ocean lets creatures this specialized take over completely, only to turn on them without warning? Tonight, we're going back to those prehistoric seas, the ones that created these extreme predators and then suddenly stopped supporting them. But before we sink any deeper, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? It always brightens my day to hear from you. If you're enjoying this calm journey through deep time, take a second right now to like the video and subscribe. It helps more of these peaceful explorations reach the people who need them. Now, let's continue. Long before familiar forms took shape beneath the surface, there moved a presence that did not rely on speed or grace, but on certainty. It did not chase in long pursuits or weave through open water with ease. Instead, it occupied its space with a kind of finality, as if anything that entered its reach had already crossed a threshold it could not return from. This was Dunkleosteus, a creature of the Devonian seas, more than 300 million years ago, built in a way that feels almost deliberate in its severity. Its body did not carry the flexibility of later fish, nor the lightness seen in modern swimmers. The front of it was encased in thick, interlocking plates of bone, forming a rigid shield that protected its head and upper body. These plates met in sharp edges and smooth surfaces, creating a structure that was less like armor worn and more like armor grown, inseparable from the animal itself. Where teeth might be expected, there were none in the usual sense. Instead, its jaws were formed from sharpened bony plates, honed through constant use into edges capable of slicing through flesh and crushing whatever lay beneath. When the mouth closed, those plates moved past each other with precision, like blades designed not to grip, but to end movement entirely. The motion was not slow. Studies of its mechanics suggest a closing speed measured in milliseconds, fast enough that resistance would barely register before it was overcome. In those waters, this kind of design carried weight. Dunkleosteus did not need to rely on endurance or elaborate hunting strategies. It existed at a point in the food chain where most encounters resolved quickly. Smaller creatures would have had little defense against such force, and even larger prey could be subdued through the sheer efficiency of its bite. It stands among the earliest examples of a true apex predator, one that shaped its environment simply by existing within it. Yet this dominance came with demands that could not be ignored. A body reinforced with dense bone, driven by powerful musculature, required a steady and substantial intake of energy. Dunkleosteus could not survive on scattered or inconsistent food sources. It depended on the presence of large, abundant prey, organisms that themselves relied on stable ecosystems to thrive. This created a quiet dependency, not immediately visible in its form, but deeply embedded in its survival. The Devonian oceans, during the time of its existence, were not as steady as they may appear from a distance. Beneath the surface, gradual shifts were already unfolding. Reef systems, which had supported a wide range of marine life, began to experience stress. These reefs were not only structures of shelter, but centers of productivity, sustaining the smaller organisms that formed the base of the food web. As they weakened, the effects moved outward, subtle at first, then increasingly difficult to sustain. At the same time, oxygen levels in certain regions of the ocean began to fluctuate. Areas that once supported complex life grew less hospitable, creating zones where large, active predators could not easily remain. For an animal like Dunkleosteus, which relied on both mobility and consistent access to prey, these changes narrowed the spaces where survival was possible. There is a stillness in how these pressures accumulate. Nothing in the form of Dunkleosteus suggests fragility. Its armor, its bite, its presence all speak of resilience and control. Yet those traits were bound to a version of the ocean that was already beginning to shift. The reefs it depended on were not permanent. The balance of oxygen and life was not fixed. Within that narrowing world, even the most decisive predator could find itself without the conditions it required. And in that quiet unraveling, the strength that once defined it becomes part of a story that no longer continues. There comes a point in long systems where change does not arrive as a single event, but as a quiet subtraction, not a sudden loss, but a gradual thinning, as if the structure that once held everything in place begins to loosen, thread by thread, until the shape remains, but the strength within it has begun to fade. For Dunkleosteus, that shift began far from its own body. The reefs that once formed dense, living frameworks across the ocean floor started to decline. These structures had supported entire layers of life, from the smallest drifting organisms to the larger creatures that fed among their branches. As they weakened, the intricate pathways of movement and shelter began to fragment. Spaces that once held abundance grew sparse, and the patterns of encounter that had sustained predator and prey alike became less certain. This loss did not remain isolated. The decline of reefs carried outward into the wider ocean, altering the balance of life in ways that were not immediately visible, but steadily cumulative. Species that depended on these environments began to diminish. Some disappeared entirely from certain regions, while others became fewer, their presence no longer enough to support those above them. At the same time, the chemistry of the ocean itself began to shift. Oxygen levels, once sufficient across large areas, started to fall in regions that had previously supported active complex life. These low oxygen zones expanded slowly, creating pockets where movement became more difficult and survival more constrained. For smaller organisms, adaptation was possible through slower metabolisms or different behaviors. For larger predators, the options were far more limited. Dunkleosteus, with its dense armor and powerful musculature, required a constant flow of energy. Its way of feeding was not suited to scarcity. The prey it depended on, already reduced by the loss of reef systems, became increasingly difficult to find. Encounters that once occurred with regularity grew infrequent, separated by longer stretches of emptiness. Its own design offered little flexibility in response. The structure of its jaws, so effective in dealing with large, substantial prey, did not allow for easy transition to smaller or more elusive organisms. It was not built to filter, to graze, or to pursue in extended chases. Each aspect of its form had been refined for a specific role, one that assumed the continued presence of certain kinds of life within its reach. As those assumptions began to fail, its size, once an advantage, became a burden. A large body requires continuity. a steady intake that matches its demands. In times of abundance, this balance holds without strain. In times of decline, the gap between need and availability widens. Energy is spent searching, maintaining, enduring, while the return becomes uncertain. The ocean did not collapse all at once. It shifted in gradients, in layers, in regions that changed at different rates. There would have been places where conditions remained stable for a time, where Dunkleosteus could still exist as it once had. But those spaces grew fewer, separated by distances that were not easily crossed, especially as the surrounding waters became less hospitable. Within this narrowing landscape, populations would have thinned. Encounters between individuals became less frequent, reducing the possibility of reproduction. Each generation, if it continued at all, would have faced a world slightly less accommodating than the one before. In geological terms, the interval of its disappearance is brief. What appears in the fossil record is not a slow fading across countless layers, but a presence that ends within a relatively narrow span. The remains that once marked its dominance cease to appear, leaving behind only the traces already set into stone. Nothing in its form suggests failure. The armor remains intact, the jaws still capable, the design unchanged. Yet the conditions that once allowed such a creature to exist no longer aligned with what it required. And within that quiet divergence, its place in the ocean came to an end, not through weakness, but through a world that no longer held the shape it was made for. In a time when the outlines of life were still being tested, there appeared a form that seemed to fold inward on itself, as though its design had turned away from the familiar path and followed a quieter, more unusual direction. It did not present its structure openly. Much of what defined it remained concealed, hidden within the curve of its own anatomy, revealed only in fragments long after its movement through the water had ended. Helicoprion lived roughly 270 million years ago in seas that carried their own balance of stability and change. At first glance, it would not have seemed entirely out of place among other early sharks. Its body likely followed a streamlined shape, suited for steady movement through open water. Yet the defining feature of this animal was not in its outline, but in the arrangement of its teeth, a structure so distinct that it stood apart from nearly all other known forms. Instead of rows that replaced themselves over time, its teeth were organized into a continuous spiral, a coiled whorl set deep within the lower jaw. New teeth formed at the center of the spiral, pushing older ones outward in a tight, curling sequence. This created a rolling structure that did not shed or scatter, but remained intact, growing inward as it expanded. The entire assembly moved as a single unit, turning slightly with each motion of the jaw, guiding prey inward along its curved surface. For a long time, the purpose of this structure remained uncertain, its function difficult to imagine without direct comparison. Yet the shape itself suggests a particular method of feeding, one that did not rely on crushing or tearing in broad strokes, but on controlled slicing. Soft-bodied prey, such as squid or similar organisms, would have been drawn into the mouth and guided across the spiral, where each edge of enamel contributed to a smooth, continuous cut. There is a kind of efficiency in this motion, not abrupt, but precise, allowing the animal to process its food without losing it to the surrounding water. This approach placed Helicoprion within a narrow ecological space. It did not compete through force or size, nor did it depend on the wide availability of varied prey. Its survival was linked to the presence of specific organisms, those whose bodies matched the function of its unusual jaw. Within that niche, it could move with quiet effectiveness, occupying a role that few others could replicate. The oceans of that period offered such spaces, regions where certain forms of life flourished in patterns that held steady over long stretches of time. In these environments, specialization could persist, allowing structures like the tooth whorl to remain not only viable but successful. Helicoprion existed within this balance, its design aligned with the conditions around it in a way that did not require constant adjustment. Yet the same alignment carried a hidden constraint. A feeding system so finely tuned could not easily shift when those conditions began to change. If the availability of soft-bodied prey declined, or if the environments that supported them altered in subtle ways, the advantages of the spiral would not translate into new opportunities. Its form did not lend itself to crushing harder shells or pursuing different kinds of organisms. Each aspect of its structure pointed in a single direction, one that assumed continuity in the world around it. There is a quiet intricacy in how such a design comes into being, shaped over time through pressures that refine rather than expand. The spiral grows, turn by turn, each layer built upon the last, until it forms a complete and self-contained system. It is a solution that fits its moment with remarkable clarity, and within that clarity, there is also a limit. The same inward curve that guided its feeding also defined the boundaries of what it could become, holding it within a narrow path that extended only as far as the ocean allowed. At first, nothing in the shape of that spiral suggests limitation. It appears as a refined solution, each curve placed with purpose, each surface aligned with a specific way of feeding that once fit cleanly into the surrounding world. The motion of it, turning inward, guiding prey along its path, carries a sense of completion, as though it had reached a form that no longer needed to change. But refinement can narrow as much as it perfects. In the long continuity of the ocean, conditions rarely remain fixed. Subtle variations begin to gather, small shifts in temperature, in chemistry, in the distribution of life that do not announce themselves all at once. They move quietly through the system, altering patterns that had once seemed stable. For Helicoprion, these changes did not arrive as a direct threat, but as a gradual thinning of the relationships it depended on. The soft-bodied organisms that matched its feeding structure began to decline in certain regions, their numbers reduced by changes in habitat and the slow reorganization of marine ecosystems. What had once been a reliable presence became uneven, appearing in scattered pockets rather than across wide areas. In response, other species moved differently. Some adapted by widening their diet, shifting from one type of prey to another as availability changed. Others evolved feeding mechanisms that allowed them to process a broader range of organisms, increasing their chances of finding sustenance in a shifting environment. These adjustments did not require immediate transformation, only a gradual flexibility that could absorb change without breaking. Helicoprion did not share that flexibility. Its spiral, so effective in a stable context, did not easily accommodate new forms of feeding. The structure was inwardly committed, built around a specific interaction between predator and prey. It could not be reoriented without losing the very function that defined it. As a result, each reduction in suitable prey had a direct impact, narrowing the conditions under which it could continue. There is a quiet pressure in such narrowing, not sudden but persistent. The ocean continues to move, currents shift, species redistribute, and within that movement, certain forms find themselves less able to follow. Helicoprion remained tied to a particular layer of the ecosystem, one that no longer held the same density or continuity it once had. At the same time, competition grew in subtle ways. More adaptable predators, capable of adjusting their feeding strategies, began to occupy spaces that had once been less contested. They could take advantage of a wider range of prey, moving between niches as conditions required. This did not displace Helicoprion directly, but it reduced the margin within which it could exist. The narrowing became cumulative. Fewer prey, less consistent access, increasing overlap with species that could endure broader conditions. Each factor alone might have been manageable, but together they formed a pattern that did not favor continuation. The spiral remained precise, its edges unchanged, its motion still capable of performing exactly as it had before. Yet the world it interacted with had shifted just enough to make that precision less useful. Over time, this imbalance deepened. Populations would have become more isolated, their numbers reduced by the difficulty of sustaining themselves within shrinking niches. Reproduction, already dependent on proximity and timing, would have faced increasing obstacles. Each generation would have carried the same specialized design into an environment that offered fewer opportunities for it to function as intended. The record left behind reflects this quiet outcome. The presence of Helicoprion does not stretch forward indefinitely, but resolves within a span that, in geological terms, passes quickly. Its distinctive structure remains preserved in stone, the spiral intact, a record of a design that once aligned perfectly with its world. And in that preserved curve, there is a sense of completeness that does not extend beyond its time. The form did not fail in itself. It remained consistent, unchanged in its purpose. But the conditions that once made it viable had shifted beyond its reach, and within that gradual divergence, the path it followed came to an end. Across the wide expanse of Jurassic seas, there were moments when the surface gave no indication of what moved below, when the water appeared undisturbed, holding its depth and silence without trace. Beneath that calm, a different kind of presence existed, one that did not need constant motion to assert itself, but carried its dominance in the scale and structure of its body alone. Liopleurodon belonged to this hidden layer, a marine reptile whose form was built not for display, but for decisive interaction. Its body stretched long and powerful, driven by broad flippers that moved with controlled force rather than speed alone. The water did not resist it so much as part around it, each motion deliberate, conserving energy while maintaining readiness. At the front of this body, its skull extended into a shape that held both mass and function in balance. The jaws were immense, lined with conical teeth designed not for delicate precision, but for securing and holding prey with overwhelming force. When they closed, the pressure they exerted would have been enough to subdue even large, struggling animals. There was no need for repeated attempts. A single successful strike would have been sufficient to end resistance. Yet strength alone did not define its place. The seas it inhabited were vast, and prey did not simply present itself without effort. Liopleurodon likely relied on a combination of sensory awareness and timing, detecting movement through subtle changes in the water. Pressure waves, chemical traces, and the faint signals carried through its environment would have guided it toward potential targets long before they came into view. This allowed it to operate not as a constant pursuer, but as an ambush predator. It could remain within a region, conserving energy, waiting for the right moment when proximity and opportunity aligned. When that moment arrived, its movement would have been sudden and controlled, closing distance quickly before its jaws completed the interaction. The balance between stillness and action formed the rhythm of its existence. Within its ecosystem, there were few, if any, that could challenge it directly. It occupied the highest level of its food chain, feeding on large fish, other marine reptiles, and any organism that fell within its reach. This position brought a kind of stability, as it did not rely on evasion or concealment in the same way as smaller creatures. Its presence shaped the behavior of those around it, influencing patterns of movement and distribution across the sea. The environment that supported such a creature was itself aligned with its needs. During the Jurassic period, ocean temperatures remained relatively warm, and sea levels created broad, shallow regions rich in life. These conditions allowed complex food chains to develop, supporting a steady flow of energy from the smallest organisms upward. In such a system, large predators could exist without immediate scarcity, their needs met by the abundance below. For Liopleurodon, this meant access to the vast amounts of food required to sustain its size. A body of such scale could not function without continuous intake. Each movement, each moment of activity drew from a reserve that needed to be replenished regularly. In a stable environment, this balance held without strain, allowing it to move through its world without interruption. There is a certain completeness in how these elements come together. Form, behavior, and environment align, creating a system in which each part supports the others. The predator is not separate from its world, but deeply integrated within it, its dominance reflecting the conditions that allow it to exist. And within that integration, its presence extends across entire seas, not through constant motion, but through the quiet certainty that wherever it moves, the structure of life around it adjusts in response. There is a quiet imbalance that forms at the highest point of any system, not immediately visible, yet always present. It is not written into the shape of the predator itself, but into everything that supports it, layer beneath layer, each one carrying a portion of the weight that allows the top to exist at all. For a creature like Liopleurodon, its position was not defined by isolation, but by connection. Every movement it made, every moment it sustained itself, depended on the continuity of life below it. The large bodies it consumed were themselves sustained by smaller organisms, and those by even more subtle forms drifting through the water. This structure extended downward in quiet complexity, forming a network that, when stable, could support immense demand without strain. Yet stability in the ocean has always been temporary. Over time, shifts in climate began to alter the conditions that held this network together. Temperature changes, gradual at first, moved through the water in ways that affected circulation and distribution. Warm currents expanded into new regions, while others cooled or slowed, reshaping the pathways through which nutrients traveled. As these currents changed, so too did the patterns of life they carried. Plankton populations, which formed the foundation of marine ecosystems, responded to even slight variations in temperature and chemistry. Their distribution became uneven, flourishing in some areas while declining in others. This unevenness moved upward through the food chain, affecting the abundance and movement of species that depended on them. For smaller organisms, these shifts could be met with relative flexibility. They could reproduce quickly, disperse widely, and adapt to changing conditions with a degree of resilience. For larger animals, the response was more constrained. Their life cycles unfolded more slowly, their movements required greater energy, and their dependence on consistent food sources limited their ability to adjust. In this changing environment, prey populations no longer followed predictable patterns. Regions that once supported steady numbers began to fluctuate, offering abundance at one time and scarcity at another. For a predator requiring large, energy-rich meals, this unpredictability introduced a quiet instability. Each successful hunt became less certain, each stretch of time between feeding more significant. Liopleurodon, for all its strength and presence, could not detach itself from this shifting foundation. Its body, built for power and efficiency within a stable system, required continuity to function as intended. Without regular access to sufficient prey, the balance between energy gained and energy spent began to narrow. Movement, once effortless within a rich environment, became a more calculated act. There is a stillness in how such pressures take hold. No single moment marks the beginning of decline. Instead, it emerges through accumulation, through the gradual misalignment of needs and availability. The predator remains capable, its senses intact, its jaws as strong as before, yet the world it moves through no longer provides with the same consistency. Other species, less bound to a single role, could adjust their behavior or diet, shifting toward whatever resources remained accessible. This adaptability created a contrast, not in strength, but in endurance. Where flexibility allowed survival through variation, specialization began to reveal its limits. At the top of the system, these limits become most apparent. The higher the position, the greater the dependence on everything beneath it remaining intact. Any disruption, even one that begins far below, moves upward until it reaches the apex, where it can no longer be absorbed. In such a structure, dominance offers no protection from change. It exists only as long as the conditions that support it remain aligned. And when those conditions begin to drift, even slightly, the highest point becomes the most exposed, held in place by a foundation that is no longer steady. The surface of the planet has never held still for long, even when it appears calm from above. Beneath that appearance, the boundaries of land and sea continue their slow rearrangement, guided by forces deep within the earth. Over immense stretches of time, continents shift their positions, drawing closer or drifting apart, altering the shapes of coastlines and the depths of the basins between them. As these movements unfold, the oceans respond in kind. Pathways that once allowed water to circulate freely become narrowed or redirected. New passages open where none existed before, while others close, separating regions that had once been connected. These changes do not happen all at once, but they accumulate, gradually reshaping the routes along which heat and nutrients travel. Sea levels rise and fall alongside these shifts, expanding shallow regions at one moment and withdrawing them at another. When waters advance over continental margins, they create broad, illuminated environments where life can gather in abundance. When they recede, those same areas are left exposed or reduced, removing habitats that had supported dense communities. The balance between depth and light, between open ocean and coastal shallows, begins to fluctuate. With these changes, the distribution of nutrients becomes uneven. Currents that once carried essential elements across large distances begin to alter their courses, concentrating resources in some areas while leaving others depleted. Upwelling zones, where deeper waters rise to the surface, bringing with them the building blocks of life, may weaken or shift location. Regions that once sustained rich ecosystems find themselves receiving less of what they need. In such conditions, productivity does not disappear entirely, but it becomes fragmented. Pockets of abundance remain, separated by stretches where life is less dense, less interconnected. Organisms that depend on consistent access to food must adjust to this new arrangement, moving between areas or narrowing their range to where conditions still align with their needs. This fragmentation extends through entire ecosystems. Species that once interacted regularly across wide regions become isolated within smaller zones. Migration patterns shift, reproduction cycles are affected, and the connections that once linked different parts of the ocean begin to loosen. The system does not collapse in a single moment, but its coherence begins to fade. For larger organisms, particularly those that rely on stable and predictable environments, this loss of continuity introduces a subtle but persistent strain. The pathways they follow no longer lead to the same outcomes. Areas that once provided reliable resources may change without clear pattern, requiring constant adjustment. The energy spent adapting to these variations begins to increase, even as the rewards become less certain. At the same time, temperature variations across the ocean become more pronounced. As currents shift, so too does the distribution of warmth, creating regions that differ more sharply than before. Some areas grow warmer, others cooler, each change influencing the types of organisms that can thrive there. This further alters the composition of ecosystems, adding another layer of variability to an already shifting system. There is a quiet accumulation in all of this, a gradual movement away from balance towards something more unstable. The ocean does not lose its capacity for life, but the conditions that once allowed for broad, continuous ecosystems begin to break into smaller, less predictable forms. Stability, once extended across vast distances, becomes localized and temporary. Within this changing world, life continues to adapt, to shift, to find new arrangements. Yet the patterns that once supported the largest and most demanding forms begin to lose their consistency. The foundation remains, but its structure has changed, no longer offering the same continuity it once held as the ocean moves into another phase of its long and unbroken transformation. By the late Cretaceous, the oceans had settled into a form that could sustain extremes, a wide and layered expanse where energy moved with a kind of continuity that allowed the largest bodies to exist without interruption. Within this arrangement, there emerged a predator whose presence did not merely fit the system, but seemed to gather its full potential into a single form. Mosasaurus moved through these waters with a structure shaped for both speed and force, its long body driven by a powerful tail that produced steady, controlled propulsion. The limbs that once belonged to its terrestrial ancestors had become flippers, compact and efficient, guiding its direction without disrupting its forward motion. There was no hesitation in its movement, no wasted effort, only a consistent translation of strength into distance. Its size alone placed it beyond most others, stretching over 50 feet, a scale that allowed it to engage with nearly anything it encountered. Yet, size was only one aspect of its dominance. The design of its skull and jaws introduced a level of capability that extended beyond simple capture. The jaw could open wide, supported by a flexible structure that allowed it to accommodate large prey. Within, a secondary set of teeth along the roof of the mouth helped secure what had been taken, preventing escape as it was drawn inward. This arrangement created a feeding process that was both decisive and continuous. Prey did not need to be reduced into smaller pieces before being consumed. Instead, Mosasaurus could take in large organisms whole, using the coordinated motion of its jaws and throat to guide them deeper into its body. The interaction did not rely on prolonged struggle, but on a sequence that moved quickly from capture to completion. Its diet reflected this capacity. Fish, smaller marine reptiles, and any available organism within reach could become part of its intake. There was no narrow specialization here, no dependence on a single type of prey. The breadth of its feeding behavior allowed it to operate across multiple layers of the ecosystem, drawing energy from a wide range of sources. This flexibility, combined with its physical capabilities, positioned it at the absolute top of its environment. The seas that supported Mosasaurus were expansive and productive. High sea levels had created vast, shallow regions rich in life, while deeper waters maintained their own complex systems. Warm temperatures allowed for continuous biological activity, reducing seasonal limitations and supporting a steady flow of energy through the food web. In such conditions, large predators could maintain their presence without constant scarcity. Within this setting, Mosasaurus did not need to remain confined to a single region. Its movement could span large distances, following patterns of prey or shifting conditions as needed. This mobility, paired with its broad diet, allowed it to remain effective even as local variations occurred. It was not tied to a single structure or niche, but could engage with the ocean on a wider scale. There is a sense of culmination in this form, as if multiple lines of development had converged into a single expression of what a marine predator could become. The strength, the speed, the adaptability within its feeding, all aligned with an environment capable of sustaining them. It represents a point where the balance between organism and system reached a kind of peak, each supporting the other in full. And in that alignment, its presence extended across entire oceans, not as a fleeting emergence, but as a sustained condition where dominance was not challenged by limitation, but maintained by the very structure of the world it inhabited. There are periods in Earth's history when conditions align with such precision that scale itself seems to lose its usual limits, when the boundaries that normally constrain growth become less defined, and bodies expand into sizes that would not be sustained under more variable circumstances. These moments are not permanent, yet, while they last, they create a world where magnitude becomes a natural outcome rather than an exception. During the late Cretaceous, the arrangement of land and sea allowed this kind of expansion to unfold. Sea levels stood high, spreading water across continental margins and forming vast shallow regions that extended for great distances. These areas, bathed in sunlight and connected across wide expanses, became centers of continuous biological activity. Light penetrated easily, and with it came the steady production of energy at the base of the marine system. The climate remained warm across much of the planet, reducing sharp contrasts between regions and limiting the disruptions that colder conditions might introduce. In such an environment, seasonal extremes softened, allowing life to persist without the interruptions that often shape survival. Growth could continue with fewer constraints, and reproduction could proceed without long pauses. Within these shallow seas, microscopic organisms formed dense populations, drifting in currents that carried them across entire basins. These organisms, though individually small, collectively created a vast reservoir of energy. As they multiplied, they supported layers of life above them, each level drawing from the one below in a continuous exchange that rarely faltered. Small fish and invertebrates thrived in this abundance, their numbers sustained by the constant availability of food. In turn, they became a reliable resource for larger species, allowing those higher in the food chain to grow without encountering frequent scarcity. The structure of the ecosystem extended upward in a smooth gradient, each layer reinforcing the stability of the next. For large predators, this arrangement offered a rare consistency. The energy required to sustain a massive body could be met without prolonged search or competition that might otherwise limit their presence. Movement across these seas did not lead to empty stretches, but to new regions where life continued in similar patterns. This continuity allowed predators to maintain their size and activity without interruption. There is a quiet reinforcement within such systems, where abundance at the base supports complexity above, and that complexity, in turn, stabilizes the overall structure. Interactions between species become more intricate, yet also more dependable, as each part of the system is sustained by a steady flow of resources. The ocean, in this state, functions as a cohesive whole rather than a collection of separate regions. Extreme body sizes emerge naturally within this context, without the usual constraints imposed by fluctuating resources or unstable conditions. Organisms can grow larger, develop more specialized features, and occupy roles that would otherwise be unsustainable. The presence of these giants reflects not only their own design, but the capacity of their environment to support them continuously. At every level, from the smallest drifting forms to the largest moving bodies, the system holds together with a kind of quiet balance. Energy flows without interruption, interactions remain consistent, and the conditions that support life persist across time. There is no single point of strain, no immediate indication that this arrangement might shift. For a time, this balance allows the ocean to carry forms that push the limits of size and capability. The alignment between environment and organism becomes nearly complete, each reinforcing the other in a cycle that sustains itself without visible effort. And within that alignment, everything holds in place, as though the system has reached a state where its structure no longer needs to adjust. And for a while, the ocean continues in this form, supporting its largest inhabitants without resistance. Without warning in any local sense, the planet entered a moment that did not belong to the slow rhythms that had guided it for millions of years. From far beyond the atmosphere, a mass of rock followed a path that intersected with Earth, carrying with it an energy that would be released in a single, irreversible instant. When it struck, the boundary between land, sea, and sky dissolved into a single event. The impact occurred roughly 66 million years ago, and the force it delivered moved outward in all directions at once. The surface fractured, and the surrounding region was subjected to temperatures far beyond anything sustained in natural conditions. Material was thrown upward and outward, lifted into the atmosphere in vast quantities. Rock vaporized, sediments were displaced, and the immediate environment transformed in a way that left no gradual transition between what had been and what followed. Beyond the point of impact, the effects continued to expand. Shock waves traveled through the crust and across the oceans, displacing water with enough force to generate waves that moved across entire basins. These waves did not resemble ordinary motion. They carried the energy of the collision, rising and spreading outward, reaching coastlines far from the initial event. In their passage, they altered shorelines, moved sediments, and reshaped the edges of continents. At the same time, the material ejected into the atmosphere began to settle into a different kind of influence. Fine particles, suspended high above the surface, spread across the planet, forming a layer that reduced the passage of sunlight. The brightness that had sustained life at the surface diminished, not entirely absent, but weakened to a degree that altered the processes dependent on it. This reduction in light reached into the upper layers of the ocean, where photosynthetic organisms relied on consistent illumination to convert energy into forms usable by the rest of the ecosystem. As the light declined, their activity slowed. The continuous production that had supported the marine food web began to falter, not through the disappearance of these organisms, but through the loss of the conditions they required to function. Temperature responded as well. With less sunlight reaching the surface, the upper layers of the ocean began to cool. This change did not occur evenly across all regions, but it was widespread enough to alter the gradients that had guided circulation. The balance between warm and cooler waters shifted, influencing the movement of currents and the distribution of nutrients. On land, fires ignited as debris re-entered the atmosphere, heating the air and surface in brief but intense intervals. These fires contributed additional material to the atmosphere, reinforcing the layer that continued to limit sunlight. The effects became interconnected, each one extending the influence of the impact beyond the moment of collision. In the oceans, the consequences unfolded through the systems that had once sustained such continuity. The reduction in photosynthesis meant that the base of the food chain was no longer producing at the same rate. Organisms that depended on this steady supply began to experience scarcity. This change moved upward through the ecosystem, affecting each level in turn. There is a quiet transition within this process, where the initial violence gives way to a prolonged alteration of conditions. The immediate impact passed quickly, but the state it created remained. The ocean, once sustained by a consistent flow of energy from above, now operated under reduced input, its systems adjusting to a diminished foundation. Within this altered environment, the continuity that had supported large, complex ecosystems began to weaken. The structure remained, but its capacity to sustain itself at previous levels had changed, as the planet settled into the aftermath of an event that had arrived in an instant, yet extended its influence across a much longer span of time. Light, once filtered and softened by the surface above, no longer reached the ocean in the same way. It arrived weakened, scattered by what remained suspended in the atmosphere, reduced to a dim presence that could not sustain the processes it once supported without interruption. The upper layers of the sea, which had depended on that steady illumination, began to shift into a different state, one where energy no longer entered with the same consistency. Within these layers, plankton had formed the quiet foundation of nearly every marine system. These drifting organisms, small and often unseen, carried out the continuous work of transforming light into usable energy. Their presence was not dramatic, yet it was constant, and through that constancy they supported everything above them. As the light diminished, their activity slowed, then faltered, until entire populations began to decline. This decline did not announce itself in a single moment. It unfolded gradually, as fewer cells divided, as fewer blooms spread across the surface waters. Regions that had once held dense concentrations of life became thinner, their productivity reduced to levels that could no longer sustain the layers above. The ocean still moved, currents still carried what remained, but the underlying supply began to fail. From this point, the change moved upward. Organisms that fed directly on plankton, small animals that depended on their abundance, began to disappear from certain regions. Without a consistent source of food, their populations could not maintain themselves. Their numbers declined, and with them, the next level of the system began to feel the absence. Herbivorous marine life, once supported by the steady presence of these primary producers, faced increasing scarcity. Their feeding grounds no longer provided what they required, and their movements across the ocean became less effective as the resources they sought grew uneven. Some populations dwindled quickly, unable to adjust to the reduced availability, while others persisted for a time before following the same path. The structure that had once carried energy smoothly from one level to the next began to fragment. Each connection weakened as the level below it became less reliable. The system did not collapse all at once, but its continuity was lost, replaced by isolated pockets where life continued at reduced intensity. For predators, this change arrived not as a direct event, but as a growing absence. The organisms they depended on became harder to find, their patterns of movement disrupted by the decline below. What had once been a consistent presence turned intermittent, then scarce. Hunting no longer led to predictable outcomes, and the energy required to search began to outweigh the energy gained. Even the most capable hunters, those that had once moved through the ocean with complete access to its resources, found themselves within this altered system. Their strength remained, their form unchanged, yet the environment no longer provided what they needed to sustain that strength. The balance between effort and return shifted in a way that could not be corrected through adaptation alone. Mosasaurus, which had once occupied the highest position within this structure, now faced the same limitation. Its broad diet, its ability to consume large prey, all depended on the presence of those prey within its reach. As the layers below continued to decline, the supply diminished until even its range could not compensate for the absence. There is a quiet progression in how this unfolds, where each level follows the one beneath it, not through direct cause, but through dependence. The loss at the base reverberates upward, reaching even the largest forms that once seemed least affected by change. In the dimmed waters, the ocean continues to move, but its structure has altered, its foundation weakened. What remains is not the sudden end of motion, but a system that can no longer sustain the continuity it once held, as the flow of energy that supported it has nearly come to a stop. Absence does not always arrive as a slow fading. In certain moments, it appears as a clean interruption, where forms that once moved across entire oceans simply cease to continue, leaving behind no gradual transition, only a boundary between presence and silence. In the altered seas, where the flow of energy had weakened, the largest predators faced a condition they could not extend themselves beyond. Their bodies, built to operate at a high level of intake and output, required a steady exchange that no longer existed. Each movement, each attempt to locate prey, drew from reserves that could not be replenished at the same rate. What had once been balanced became a deficit that deepened with time. There is a particular weight carried by large forms in such conditions. Their scale, which once allowed them to dominate, now required more than the system could provide. Musculature designed for powerful motion, organs that supported sustained activity, all depended on consistent nourishment. Without it, the processes that maintained their bodies began to slow, then fail to meet the demands placed upon them. The search for food extended across greater distances, yet the outcome remained uncertain. Prey had not only diminished in number, but had become unevenly distributed, appearing in scattered regions rather than across continuous ranges. For predators accustomed to reliability, this introduced a pattern that could not be predicted or stabilized. Each interval between successful feeding grew longer, each effort more costly. In such a state, energy is not only consumed through movement, but through the maintenance of life itself. Even in stillness, a large body requires constant input. Without it, internal systems begin to adjust, conserving where possible, reducing activity. Yet these adjustments can only extend survival for a limited duration. The underlying imbalance remains: reproduction. Already a slower process among large marine animals, became increasingly difficult to sustain. Fewer individuals encountered one another within the expanding distances between populations. The conditions required for successful reproduction, timing, proximity, sufficient energy reserves, became less likely to align. Even when they did, the survival of offspring depended on a world that no longer supported steady growth. Each generation, if it continued at all, faced an environment that had shifted beyond the parameters within which it had evolved. The traits that once ensured success could not compensate for the absence of resources. Adaptation, which unfolds across long spans, could not match the pace of change that had taken place. The decline did not stretch indefinitely. In geological terms, the interval is brief, a narrow band in the layers that record their existence. Fossils that once appeared regularly within these layers become fewer, then absent altogether. The record does not show a prolonged struggle, but a relatively swift transition from presence to disappearance. Entire lineages, some extending across millions of years, reach their endpoint within this span. Their forms, once widespread and varied, no longer continue into subsequent layers. What remains are the structures preserved before the shift, bones and impressions that hold the outline of what had been, without any continuation beyond that point. There is a stillness in this kind of ending. It does not carry the visible markers of conflict or gradual decline. It reflects a misalignment between organism and environment that cannot be resolved within the time available. The giants, for all their scale and capability, remain bound to the systems that sustain them, and when those systems no longer provide, their presence cannot extend further. In the quiet that follows, the ocean continues, its surface moving, its depths carrying what remains. Yet the forms that once defined its upper limits have been removed, leaving behind a space that no longer holds what it once did. In the long quiet that followed the disappearance of the great marine reptiles, the ocean did not remain empty. Its surface continued to move. Its depths still held currents and gradients, and within this altered world, new forms began to take shape. Not as replacements in a direct sense, but as expressions of a different path, unfolding through the same waters. Among these emerging forms was Basilosaurus, an early whale that carried with it a body unlike anything that had ruled before. Its length extended beyond 60 feet, yet the way that length was arranged created a presence that felt less rigid, more continuous, as though its form flowed rather than stood defined. The spine stretched in a long sequence of vertebrae, producing a silhouette that curved gently through the water, reminiscent of a serpent moving through an open space. This structure marked a shift in how large marine predators could exist. Where earlier forms relied on limbs transformed into flippers or fins, Basilosaurus carried remnants of its terrestrial ancestry within its elongated body. Small hind limbs remained, no longer suited for movement, yet still present as a trace of what had come before. Its primary propulsion came from the motion of its body and tail, undulating in a pattern that carried it forward with steady, rhythmic force. As a mammal, its physiology introduced a different way of interacting with the ocean. It breathed air, rising to the surface at intervals, then descending again into the depths where it hunted. This connection between surface and depth created a pattern of movement distinct from those that had lived entirely within the water, linking two layers of the environment in a continuous cycle. Its role within the ecosystem reflected both its size and its capability. Basilosaurus occupied the position of an apex predator, feeding on other marine mammals and large fish that had come to inhabit the recovering seas. Its teeth, sharp and well-suited for gripping and tearing, allowed it to secure prey with efficiency. The interactions it engaged in were direct, its size and strength providing an advantage within the environments it moved through. The ocean it inhabited was not the same as the one that had supported the giants before. It had passed through disruption and was in the process of re-establishing its balance. New food chains had formed, built upon different compositions of life, yet still capable of sustaining large predators. The structure was not identical, but it held enough continuity to allow such forms to emerge once more. Within this evolving system, Basilosaurus found its place. Its long body allowed it to move through open water with control, its sensory capabilities guiding it toward prey within a world that had regained some measure of stability. It did not rely on the same conditions as those that had preceded it, but on a configuration that had taken shape after the earlier collapse. There is a sense of adaptation within its form, not in rapid change, but in the alignment between its structure and the conditions it encountered. It reflects a different solution to the same underlying demands of survival, one that incorporates the legacy of life on land into the vastness of the ocean. And within that solution, it becomes a dominant presence once more, moving through the water with a continuity that connects past and present, carrying forward the capacity for large predators to exist, even as the ocean itself continues to reshape the possibilities it allows. Recovery in the ocean does not unfold as a sudden return, but as a slow layering of life upon what remains, each addition subtle, each step building upon conditions that have only just begun to stabilize. After the Great Disruption, the waters did not immediately regain their former complexity. Instead, they entered a quieter phase, where new patterns formed gradually, guided by what could endure rather than what had once dominated. In this altered world, the absence of earlier giants left open spaces within the structure of marine life. These spaces were not empty for long, yet what filled them did not mirror what had come before. The organisms that persisted through the disruption carried different traits, different capacities for survival within unstable conditions, and from these, new systems began to emerge. Marine ecosystems rebuilt themselves from the lower levels upward. Microscopic life regained its presence first, re-establishing the steady production that would support all higher forms. As conditions in the upper layers of the ocean became more consistent, these organisms expanded across broader regions, restoring the flow of energy that had once been interrupted. Their return was not uniform, but it was sufficient to begin supporting more complex life again. From this foundation, new food chains took shape. Small fish and invertebrates appeared in increasing numbers, their populations growing as the availability of resources improved. These organisms formed the next layer, linking the base of the system to larger species that would depend on them. Each level developed in response to what lay beneath it, creating a structure that, while different in composition, retained the essential continuity required for stability. Ocean temperatures, which had fluctuated during the earlier disruption, began to settle into more predictable patterns. Currents adjusted to the new arrangement of heat across the planet, redistributing nutrients in ways that supported the growth of these emerging ecosystems. The balance between regions, though not identical to what had existed before, became steady enough to allow life to persist and expand. Within this rebuilding system, mammals began to occupy roles that had previously been held by reptiles. Their physiology, shaped by a different evolutionary path, offered new approaches to life in the ocean. Breathing air, regulating internal temperature, and possessing different reproductive strategies, they introduced variations in how large marine organisms could exist and interact with their environment. These mammals did not simply replace earlier forms, but redefined what it meant to occupy the upper levels of the food chain. Their movements, their feeding behaviors, and their interactions with the ocean reflected a new set of conditions, one that favored adaptability within a system still finding its equilibrium. Over time, they expanded into a range of niches, some becoming predators capable of engaging with large prey, others specializing in different layers of the ecosystem. Evolution, working within this context, produced forms that had no direct precedent in the earlier seas. Structures developed in response to the current environment rather than past conditions, resulting in bodies and behaviors that aligned with the new balance of the ocean. These predators were not shaped by the same constraints or opportunities as those that had vanished, but by a system that had been rebuilt from a different starting point. There is a quiet continuity in this process, where life does not return to what it was, but moves forward into what it can become. The ocean, though changed, retains its capacity to support complexity, to generate new forms, and to sustain them over time. And within this renewed structure, the rules that govern survival are no longer the same as before, shaped instead by the conditions that emerged from the aftermath, guiding life along paths that extend beyond what once defined the limits of the sea. Not all endings arrive with the same clarity. Some unfold within systems that appear stable, where movement continues, where life remains present and active, and yet beneath that continuity, subtle pressures begin to reshape what can endure. The ocean that carried Basilosaurus forward was no longer in recovery, but it was not unchanging either. Over time, shifts in temperature and circulation continued to refine the distribution of life. These changes did not disrupt the system entirely, but they altered the availability of prey in ways that were uneven and gradual. Regions that once held consistent populations of marine mammals and large fish began to vary, offering abundance at certain times and scarcity at others. For a predator dependent on substantial prey, this variation introduced a quiet imbalance. Basilosaurus, with its long and elongated body, moved through these waters in a manner suited to an earlier configuration of the ocean. Its motion, driven by undulating waves along its spine, allowed it to travel with steady force. Yet this method carried an energy cost that became more apparent as conditions shifted. In a world where prey could no longer be found with the same reliability, efficiency began to matter in ways it had not before. At the same time, other whales were evolving along different paths. Their bodies became shorter, more compact, their tails developing horizontal flukes that generated propulsion with greater efficiency. This change allowed for faster movement over long distances, reducing the energy required to search for food. These emerging forms could navigate the ocean with a balance of speed and conservation, adjusting to the changing distribution of prey with greater flexibility. As these more streamlined whales increased in number, the dynamic within the upper levels of the ecosystem began to shift. They did not directly displace Basilosaurus, yet their presence introduced a form of competition that operated through efficiency rather than confrontation. In environments where resources varied, the ability to move further with less energy, to locate and capture prey with greater consistency, provided an advantage that accumulated over time. Basilosaurus remained capable within its own design. Its size and strength continued to allow it to capture large prey when such opportunities arose. Yet the intervals between those opportunities grew less predictable, and the cost of maintaining its body within these conditions increased. Each movement, each search, required more from a system that offered less in return. There is a quiet constraint in such a situation, where the structure of the body itself limits the directions in which adaptation can proceed. The elongated form of Basilosaurus, so distinctive and effective within its original context, could not easily transition into the more compact, efficient designs that were beginning to dominate. Evolution does not always rework existing forms into entirely new shapes within a short span. Often, it favors those already aligned with emerging conditions. As generations passed, this alignment became more significant. The whales that moved with greater efficiency, that could sustain themselves within a variable environment, continued to expand their presence. Basilosaurus, tied to a form that no longer matched the shifting demands of the ocean, found its range of viable conditions narrowing. The record of its existence reflects this gradual divergence. Its remains appear within a defined span, then cease, not through a sudden event, but through a transition where other forms continue while it does not. The ocean remains inhabited, active, and complex, yet the specific combination of traits that defined Basilosaurus no longer persists within it. There is no abrupt silence here, only a quiet replacement where one expression of life gives way to another that better fits the evolving structure of the sea. And within that ongoing transformation, Basilosaurus becomes part of what has been, its long form preserved in stone, while the ocean continues to favor those shapes that move with greater efficiency through its changing depths. Across these long passages of time, a sequence begins to take shape, not as a single event, but as a recurring arrangement that emerges under different conditions with different forms, yet follows a similar path. It does not announce itself in advance, nor does it follow a fixed schedule, but once it begins, its structure becomes visible in retrospect, traced through the presence and absence of those that once dominated. At first, there is emergence. A form appears that aligns closely with the conditions of its environment, its structure matching the resources available, its behavior fitting the patterns that surround it. This alignment allows it to expand, to occupy space more effectively than others, and to establish itself within the system. Over time, its presence becomes more pronounced, shaping the interactions around it, influencing what thrives and what recedes. From this emergence, dominance follows naturally. The organism, or group of organisms, reaches a point where its capabilities allow it to move through its environment with minimal resistance. It becomes a defining feature of its ecosystem, not through isolation, but through its integration with the structures that support it. Energy flows toward it through multiple pathways, sustaining its position without immediate constraint. As time continues, adaptation refines this dominance. Features become more specialized, more closely tuned to the conditions that have allowed success. The body, the behavior, the interactions all become more precise, reducing inefficiencies and strengthening the connection between the organism and its environment. At this stage, the system appears stable, its components aligned in a way that supports continuity. Yet within this refinement lies a quiet narrowing. The more closely a form is adapted to a specific set of conditions, the more it depends on those conditions remaining consistent. This dependency is not apparent while the environment holds steady, but it becomes significant when change begins to unfold. Environmental shifts do not always arrive with intensity. Often, they begin subtly, altering temperature, chemistry, or the distribution of resources in ways that accumulate over time. These changes move through the system, affecting the smallest components first, then extending upward. The base of the structure adjusts, sometimes gradually, sometimes more abruptly, and with it, the layers above begin to respond. As these shifts continue, the coherence of the ecosystem begins to weaken. Connections that once supported stable interactions become less reliable. Food chains lose their continuity, and the balance between supply and demand begins to falter. What had been a cohesive system transitions into one that is fragmented, its parts no longer fully aligned. At this point, the forms that once dominated encounter a limitation that cannot be resolved through their existing adaptations. Their specialization, which had once ensured success, restricts their ability to respond to the new conditions. The traits that defined their peak become boundaries that prevent further adjustment. The collapse that follows is not always prolonged. In many cases, it occurs within a span that is brief when measured against the time that preceded it. Populations decline, then disappear, leaving behind a record that shows a clear transition from presence to absence. The strength, the scale, the refinement that once defined these forms does not extend beyond the conditions that supported them. And then, as the system reorganizes, new forms begin to emerge, shaped by the altered environment, following paths that reflect a different set of conditions. The sequence begins again, not as a repetition in exact detail, but as a pattern that carries the same underlying structure. Within this ongoing cycle, dominance remains temporary, tied to the moment in which it arises, while the ocean continues to shift, guiding life through phases of emergence, refinement, and quiet disappearance. Scale carries with it a quiet obligation, one that is not visible in the outline of a body, but present in every moment that body continues to exist. The larger the form, the more it depends on a continuous exchange with its environment, a steady flow of energy that must be maintained without interruption. This requirement does not diminish during periods of stability, yet it becomes more apparent when the surrounding system begins to shift. A large organism moves through the ocean with a presence that reflects its accumulated structure. Muscle, tissue, and internal systems operate together, each sustained by the intake of food that must match the demands placed upon them. Even in stillness, energy is consumed. Maintenance alone requires a constant supply, and any reduction in that supply begins to affect the balance that holds the organism together. When food is abundant, this balance is maintained with relative ease. Large predators can move through their environment, locating prey with enough regularity to sustain their size. Their strength allows them to engage with substantial organisms, and the energy gained from each successful interaction supports the continuation of their form. In such conditions, scale appears as an advantage, allowing access to resources that smaller organisms might not reach. Yet this advantage depends entirely on the consistency of the system that provides those resources. When that system begins to fluctuate, the relationship between size and survival changes. Food shortages do not affect all organisms equally. Smaller species, requiring less energy, can persist through periods of scarcity with greater flexibility. They can adjust their behavior, reduce activity, or rely on limited resources for longer spans. For larger species, the margin for adjustment is narrower. Their energy requirements remain high regardless of external conditions. When prey becomes less available, the time and effort required to obtain it increases, while the return becomes uncertain. Each unsuccessful search represents not only a missed opportunity, but a depletion of reserves that are not easily replaced. This imbalance accumulates over time. A single period of scarcity may be endured, but repeated intervals begin to erode the capacity to recover. The body, which once operated with strength and continuity, must begin to compensate for the lack of input, drawing upon stored energy, reducing activity where possible. These adjustments can extend survival, but they cannot restore the balance indefinitely. Reproduction adds another layer to this constraint. Large organisms often reproduce more slowly, their life cycles extending over longer periods. This means that population recovery depends on conditions remaining favorable for extended spans. When environments become unstable, the likelihood of successive generations reaching maturity decreases. Fewer individuals contribute to the next cycle, and the overall population begins to decline. Environmental stress amplifies these effects. Changes in temperature, oxygen levels, or habitat availability may be manageable for smaller organisms that can adapt quickly or occupy different niches. For larger species, such changes interact with their existing demands, creating conditions that are increasingly difficult to navigate. The space within which they can survive becomes more limited, defined by the need to meet multiple requirements simultaneously. There is a quiet shift in how size is perceived within this context. What once allowed dominance becomes a factor that increases exposure to risk. The very traits that supported success under stable conditions begin to constrain survival when those conditions change. Strength remains, capability remains, yet the environment no longer aligns with the needs those traits create. Within this dynamic, the relationship between organism and system reveals its dependence. Size does not exist independently of the conditions that sustain it. It reflects a balance that can hold for long periods, yet remains sensitive to the underlying structure of the environment. And when that structure begins to change, the largest forms, once supported by its continuity, find themselves at the edge of what can be maintained, where scale no longer provides security, but becomes part of the challenge they must endure. There is an element within the ocean that cannot be seen, yet it shapes the boundaries of where life can exist, how it moves, and how long it can endure. It is carried within the water itself, dissolved and distributed through currents, quietly sustaining the processes that allow organisms to function from moment to moment. Oxygen, though invisible, defines the limits of activity beneath the surface. Every movement, every contraction of muscle, every exchange within the body depends on its presence. When it is available in sufficient amounts, life can expand into complex forms, sustaining motion, growth, and interaction across wide regions. The ocean, in this state, becomes a space where energy can be used freely, where organisms can operate without immediate constraint. Yet the distribution of oxygen is not constant. It varies with temperature, circulation, and the structure of the water column. Warmer waters hold less dissolved oxygen, and when currents slow or shift, the replenishment of oxygen from the surface to deeper layers can become limited. Over time, these changes create areas where oxygen levels drop below what is required for most complex life. These regions, often referred to as low oxygen zones, do not appear suddenly, but develop gradually as conditions align. In such places, the water remains, the movement continues, yet the capacity to support active organisms diminishes. The boundaries of these zones can expand, contracting the habitable space available to species that depend on higher oxygen concentrations. For large predators, the presence of oxygen is closely tied to their ability to function. Their bodies require a continuous and substantial intake to sustain movement and maintain internal processes. When oxygen levels fall, their capacity to remain within a region decreases. Even if prey were present, the environment itself would limit their ability to pursue or consume it effectively. The space in which they can exist becomes constrained, forcing them to move or withdraw. Smaller organisms respond differently. Many possess adaptations that allow them to tolerate lower oxygen conditions, reducing their metabolic rate or utilizing alternative pathways that require less oxygen. These adjustments do not eliminate the effects of reduced oxygen, but they allow survival within environments that would exclude larger, more demanding forms. In this way, the balance of the ecosystem shifts, favoring those capable of enduring the altered conditions. As low oxygen zones expand or shift location, the structure of marine life changes in response. Regions that once supported diverse communities become less populated by large, active species. The interactions that defined those areas are altered, and the connections between different levels of the ecosystem weaken. The system does not vanish, but it reorganizes around the new constraints. Over longer periods, Fluctuations in oxygen levels contribute to broader patterns within the history of life. When oxygen becomes limited across wide regions, the effects extend beyond local ecosystems, influencing the survival of entire groups. Species that cannot adapt to these conditions decline, while others persist, shaping the direction of evolution in subtle yet significant ways. There is a quiet influence in how oxygen operates within the ocean. It does not impose sudden change, but sets the boundaries within which change can occur. Its presence allows complexity to develop, and its absence narrows the range of what can be sustained. Within this balance, the rise and fall of species are linked not only to their own traits, but to the conditions that support their most basic functions. As the distribution of oxygen continues to shift, guiding the structure of life through cycles that unfold beneath the surface, largely unseen, yet deeply consequential. There are moments in the ocean's history when the boundary between life and environment becomes indistinct, when the water itself begins to carry conditions that no longer support the forms within it. These moments do not begin at the surface, nor are they always visible from above. They emerge from within the chemistry of the sea, where balance shifts in ways that alter not only what lives there, but what the water can sustain at all. In certain conditions, when oxygen levels fall and remain low for extended periods, different processes begin to take hold in deeper layers. Microorganisms that thrive without oxygen become more active, breaking down organic matter through pathways that release hydrogen sulfide. This compound, normally confined to limited environments, can accumulate when circulation slows and oxygen is not replenished. Over time, it begins to rise, carried upward through the water column. Hydrogen sulfide does not support the forms of life that depend on oxygen. It interferes with the basic processes that allow cells to function, preventing the normal exchange that sustains activity and growth. When it spreads into regions where more complex organisms reside, its presence becomes a constraint that cannot be easily avoided. The movement of this toxic water does not remain confined to a single area. As currents shift and layers mix, it can extend across large regions, altering the chemistry of entire sections of the ocean. What had once been habitable becomes increasingly difficult to occupy, not through the absence of space, but through the presence of conditions that disrupt the most fundamental aspects of survival. Even shallow waters, which often serve as centers of biological activity, can be affected when these processes intensify. Light may still reach the surface, and the structure of the environment may remain intact, yet the underlying chemistry changes in a way that prevents life from continuing as before. Organisms that rely on oxygen find themselves within water that no longer supports their needs, and the ability to move away becomes limited as the affected regions expand. For marine life, the impact is immediate at the level of function. Respiration, the process that allows energy to be used within the body, is disrupted. Some organisms may attempt to move toward areas with more favorable conditions, but when the spread is extensive, such movement may not provide relief. Others remain within these regions, their activity slowing as the environment no longer aligns with their requirements. As this condition persists, the structure of the ecosystem begins to break apart. Species that once formed stable connections through feeding and interaction are no longer able to maintain those relationships. The base of the food chain is affected, and the layers above respond accordingly. The continuity that once allowed energy to move upward through the system is interrupted, leaving each level without the support it depends on. The collapse that follows is not always marked by sudden disappearance, but by a reduction in presence that spreads across the system. Populations decline, interactions diminish, and the complexity that defined the ecosystem gives way to a simpler, more constrained state. What remains is not entirely devoid of life, but limited to those forms capable of enduring the altered conditions. There is a quiet transformation in these moments, where the ocean itself becomes a factor that shapes not only the distribution of life, but its possibility. The water, which once carried the elements needed for survival, now carries substances that restrict it. Within this altered state, entire food chains lose their continuity, and the system reorganizes around what can persist. As the ocean moves through another phase in which its chemistry defines the limits of life within it, far below the shifting layers of light and temperature, there exists a region where change moves more slowly, where the influence of events at the surface arrives softened, filtered through depth and distance. In this part of the ocean, conditions remain comparatively steady, not untouched by time, but less subject to the rapid variations that reshape the upper waters. The deep ocean holds a different kind of continuity. Temperatures remain low and stable, pressure is constant, and the absence of sunlight creates an environment where energy does not arrive through illumination, but through the gradual descent of organic material from above. This slow input forms the basis of life in these depths, supporting organisms that have adapted to scarcity and stillness rather than abundance and motion. When disruptions occur at the surface, whether through shifts in climate, changes in chemistry, or sudden events that alter the balance of the upper ocean, their effects do not immediately transform the deep. The layers of water between act as a buffer, reducing the speed and intensity with which these changes are transmitted. As a result, the deep sea often retains conditions that remain within the limits required for survival, even as the regions above undergo significant alteration. Some species, faced with instability in shallower waters, move downward, following gradients of temperature and chemistry that lead into more stable zones. This movement is not without cost, as the deep ocean presents its own constraints: limited energy, high pressure, and the absence of light. Yet for certain organisms, these conditions offer a refuge from environments that have become uninhabitable. Within this refuge, life persists in forms that differ from those found closer to the surface. Organisms here are often adapted to slow growth, reduced activity, and long lifespans, reflecting the limited resources available. Their interactions are less frequent, their movements more deliberate, creating a system that operates on a different rhythm. Isolation plays a significant role in this persistence. The separation between deep and surface environments limits the extent to which changes in one immediately affect the other. This isolation allows lineages to continue through periods that would otherwise disrupt or eliminate them in more variable regions. Species that have existed for long spans of time remain present, their forms altered only gradually, preserving traits that connect them to distant points in Earth's history. There is a quiet continuity in these lineages, a sense that while the surface world undergoes cycles of expansion and collapse, the deep maintains a slower progression. Evolution does not cease in these depths, but it proceeds at a reduced pace, shaped by stable conditions that do not demand rapid adaptation. Changes accumulate over extended periods, resulting in forms that appear relatively unchanged when compared to their ancient counterparts. This stability does not imply permanence, as the deep ocean is still part of the larger system and can be affected by long-term shifts in circulation and chemistry. Yet its resistance to rapid change provides a contrast to the more dynamic environments above, offering a space where life can endure through transitions that would otherwise be more disruptive. In this region of darkness, where light does not reach and movement is measured, the ocean holds a record of persistence, not through dominance, but through continuity. The forms that remain are not defined by their scale or power, but by their ability to exist within a system that changes slowly, allowing them to endure across spans of time that extend beyond the reach of more transient conditions. There are forms in the ocean that do not appear to belong to a single moment, but instead carry within them a continuity that stretches across vast spans of time. They do not reflect the peaks of dominance that rise and fall, nor do they mark the extremes of adaptation that define a specific era. Instead, they persist quietly, their structures remaining recognizable even as the world around them changes. Among these are the coelacanths, fish whose lineage extends deep into the past, their form preserved with remarkable consistency. Their bodies, with their lobe-like fins and heavy scales, reflect a design that once occupied a broader presence in ancient seas. While many related forms disappeared, the coelacanth remained, its existence continuing in regions where conditions allowed it to endure without significant alteration. Their survival is not the result of remaining unchanged in every detail, but of maintaining a balance between stability and subtle adjustment. Living in deeper waters, where environmental variation is reduced, they occupy spaces that do not demand rapid transformation. Their movements are measured, their metabolism adapted to a slower pace, aligning with the limited resources available in their surroundings. Alongside them, certain deep-sea sharks carry traits that connect them to distant points in evolutionary history. Their forms do not exhibit the rapid specialization seen in more dynamic environments, but instead reflect a continuity shaped by long-term persistence. Features that might appear unusual when compared to modern surface species are, in fact, remnants of structures that have endured across changing conditions. These organisms do not dominate their ecosystems in the way that larger predators once did. They do not occupy the highest positions within food chains, nor do they rely on abundant resources to sustain themselves. Instead, they exist within a framework that prioritizes endurance, where the ability to survive with limited input becomes more significant than the capacity for rapid expansion. There is a quiet resilience in this mode of existence. By occupying environments that remain relatively stable, these species avoid many of the pressures that drive rapid change elsewhere. Their isolation, whether in depth or in specific ecological niches, protects them from disturbances that might otherwise disrupt their continuity. In these conditions, evolution proceeds at a slower pace, refining rather than redefining their structure. This persistence reveals something fundamental about survival within the ocean. Dominance, while effective under certain conditions, is not the only path through time. The forms that rise to the top of an ecosystem often depend on precise alignments that can shift, leaving them exposed when those alignments change. In contrast, species that operate within narrower, more stable conditions can endure through multiple cycles of change without needing to transform extensively. The coelacanth and these ancient sharks are not static in the absolute sense, but their rate of change is minimal compared to the rapid shifts seen in more variable environments. Their continued presence serves as a record of what can persist when adaptation is aligned with stability rather than expansion. There is a different kind of success reflected in these organisms, one that does not seek to dominate but to remain. Their forms, carried forward across millions of years, illustrate a path where survival is measured not by scale or influence, but by continuity. Within the depths and isolated regions they inhabit, the ocean holds these remnants of ancient worlds, not as relics disconnected from the present, but as living participants in an ongoing system, demonstrating that endurance often lies in the ability to exist within limits that do not demand constant change. Balance in the ocean is not a fixed state, but a continuous adjustment, held in place by countless interactions that align for a time before shifting again. It is not maintained by any single species or process, but by the quiet coordination of many, each contributing to a structure that remains stable only while its parts remain connected. Within this structure, even small variations can extend far beyond their point of origin. A slight change in temperature may alter the distribution of microscopic life, shifting where it gathers and how it grows. This change, though subtle at first, affects the organisms that depend on it, adjusting their patterns of movement and survival. From there, the effect continues upward, influencing the species that rely on them, each level responding to the changes below. The ocean does not isolate these interactions. It connects them through currents, through migration, through the continuous exchange of energy and matter. Because of this, a disturbance in one region can influence distant areas, not through direct force, but through the gradual redistribution of resources and conditions. What begins as a localized shift becomes part of a broader transformation carried across the system. Food chains, often described as simple sequences, are in reality networks of interdependence. A single species may connect to many others, forming pathways through which energy flows in multiple directions. When one part of this network changes, the effects do not remain contained. They move along these connections, altering relationships that extend far beyond the initial point of disruption. As these effects accumulate, the stability of the system begins to adjust. It does not collapse immediately, but it becomes less predictable. Patterns that once held steady begin to vary, and the connections that supported consistent interactions grow weaker. The system continues to function, yet its coherence is reduced, its responses less aligned. For apex predators, this reduction in coherence has a distinct impact. Positioned at the top of the system, they depend on the continuity of everything beneath them. Their survival is linked not only to the presence of prey, but to the stability of the entire network that produces that prey. When disruptions move through the lower levels, the effects reach them in amplified form as each layer passes along the changes it receives. Their size and specialization, which allow them to dominate under stable conditions, limit their ability to adjust when the system shifts. They cannot easily transition to different food sources, nor can they reduce their energy requirements to match reduced availability. As a result, they become sensitive to variations that smaller, more adaptable species can absorb. There is a quiet exposure in this position, where the highest level is supported by the most complex foundation. Any imbalance below, even one that begins with minor changes, can extend upward until it reaches a point where it can no longer be absorbed. The predator remains capable within itself, yet the system it depends on no longer provides the conditions required for its continued presence. This reveals a fundamental aspect of ocean ecosystems. Strength and dominance exist within a framework that must remain balanced for them to persist. When that balance shifts, even slightly, the effects move through the system, altering its structure in ways that are not immediately visible, but deeply consequential. Within this interconnected world, fragility is not a sign of weakness, but a reflection of complexity. The more intricate the system, the more pathways through which change can travel, and the more sensitive it becomes to variation. And in this sensitivity, the ocean holds a constant tension, where stability is maintained only through continuous alignment, and where even the most dominant forms remain dependent on conditions that extend far beyond their own reach. Time in the ocean is measured not only by the lives within it, but by the slow, persistent forces that move through it, shaping its structure across spans far longer than any single species can endure. These forces do not act with urgency, yet their influence is continuous, guiding the arrangement of water, heat, and life in ways that unfold gradually but without pause. Climate operates at this scale, extending beyond individual events into patterns that repeat and evolve over immense intervals. As temperatures rise and fall over these cycles, the ocean responds, not as a uniform body, but as a system of layers and currents that adjust to the distribution of heat. Warmer periods expand certain regions, altering the balance between surface and depth, while cooler phases introduce different gradients that reshape how energy moves through the system. These temperature shifts carry direct consequences for the availability of oxygen. Warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen, reducing the capacity of the ocean to support highly active organisms. At the same time, changes in temperature influence the mixing of water layers, affecting how oxygen is transported from the surface into deeper regions. When this mixing slows, oxygen becomes unevenly distributed, creating areas where its presence is reduced. Currents respond to these shifts as well, altering their pathways and intensity. These movements are not random, but guided by differences in temperature and salinity that determine how water flows across the planet. As currents change, so too does the distribution of nutrients carried from one region to another, shaping where life can flourish and where it becomes limited. Nutrient distribution forms the foundation upon which marine ecosystems are built. When currents bring nutrient-rich water into contact with sunlight, productivity increases, supporting dense populations of microscopic life. When these pathways shift, regions that once held abundance may decline, while others begin to support new growth. This redistribution does not eliminate life, but it changes its arrangement, altering the structure of ecosystems across wide areas. Within this dynamic, organisms must continually adjust to the conditions around them. Some species migrate, following the movement of favorable environments. Others adapt their behavior or physiology, aligning themselves with new patterns of temperature, oxygen, and resource availability. These adjustments allow life to persist, yet they also shape the direction of evolution, favoring traits that align with the current state of the system. The ocean, in this context, becomes a reflection of these long-term cycles. Its ecosystems are not fixed, but responsive, changing in composition as climate shifts. Stability, when it occurs, is temporary, held in place only as long as the underlying conditions remain aligned. When those conditions begin to move, even gradually, the system adjusts, sometimes subtly, sometimes with broader consequences. There is a continuity in this process, where change does not erase what exists, but transforms it, guiding life into new arrangements that reflect the current state of the environment. The forces driving these transformations operate beyond the scale of individual organisms, yet their effects are felt at every level, from the smallest cells to the largest predators. Within this ongoing movement, the ocean reveals a deeper structure, one shaped not by isolated events, but by the persistent influence of climate, guiding the distribution of energy, the flow of resources, and the conditions that define what can endure. At the height of any ecosystem, there is a presence that seems to define its limits, a form that moves without visible constraint, shaping the behavior of everything around it. From a distance, this presence carries the impression of permanence, as though its position is secured by its own strength alone, held in place by the very capabilities that allow it to dominate. Yet this impression rests on a foundation that is not immediately visible. The predator at the top does not generate the system it inhabits. It depends on layers beneath it, each contributing to the flow of energy that sustains its existence. These layers, extending from microscopic life upward, operate beyond its influence, governed by conditions that the predator cannot alter or control. There is a quiet dependence within this arrangement. The predator's success reflects not only its own structure, but the stability of the entire network that supports it. When that network functions with continuity, the predator can exist with apparent ease, its movements aligned with a system that provides what it requires. In such moments, dominance appears complete, its presence unchallenged within its environment. But this dominance is not a fixed state. It is contingent, shaped by conditions that can shift over time. Changes in temperature, in chemistry, in the distribution of resources, move through the system without regard for the position of any single organism. These changes begin at levels far below the predator, yet their effects travel upward, altering the availability of prey, the structure of habitats, and the balance of interactions that define the ecosystem. As these shifts accumulate, the foundation that supports dominance begins to adjust. The predator remains as it was, its strength intact, its capabilities unchanged. Yet the environment no longer aligns with its needs in the same way. The pathways through which energy once flowed steadily become less reliable, and the connections that sustained its position grow uncertain. There is a subtle transition in this process, where the appearance of control gives way to exposure. The predator does not lose its power in a direct sense, but finds that power limited by conditions beyond its reach. It cannot restore the balance of the system, nor can it alter the processes that have begun to reshape it. Its influence, once extensive, becomes confined to what remains within its immediate interactions. Other organisms, less specialized, respond differently. Their forms allow for adjustment, enabling them to shift their behavior, their diet, or their range in response to changing conditions. This flexibility does not grant them dominance, but it allows them to persist where more specialized forms cannot. Over time, this persistence becomes a defining factor, shaping which species continue and which do not. The contrast between strength and adaptability becomes more apparent within this context. Strength provides advantage within a stable system, allowing a species to expand and maintain its position. Adaptability provides resilience within a changing system, allowing a species to endure as conditions shift. These qualities do not always align, and when they diverge, the outcome reflects the nature of the environment rather than the capabilities of the organism alone. There is a quiet realization embedded within this pattern. Dominance, while visible and often striking, is not synonymous with permanence. It reflects a moment of alignment between organism and environment, a balance that can hold for long periods, yet remains subject to change. Within the ocean, this distinction shapes the continuity of life. The forms that appear most powerful are often those most closely tied to specific conditions, while those that endure across longer spans are those able to adjust as those conditions evolve. And in this ongoing movement, the illusion of dominance gives way to a deeper structure where survival is not secured by strength alone, but by the capacity to exist within a world that never remains the same. In the present ocean, the surface still carries the familiar motion of waves and light, yet beneath that movement, subtle signals continue to gather, tracing patterns that extend beyond a single moment. These signals do not interrupt the flow of daily life at once, but they accumulate, shaping conditions in ways that echo earlier transitions, where change begins quietly before becoming more apparent. Across many regions, areas of low oxygen have begun to expand, forming zones where the water holds less of what complex organisms require. These zones develop gradually, often linked to warming temperatures and changes in circulation that limit the mixing of oxygen from the surface into deeper layers. As they spread, the habitable space for many species becomes reduced, not through visible barriers, but through a shift in the chemistry of the water itself. At the same time, the overall temperature of the ocean is rising. This warming does not occur evenly, but it alters the balance between regions, influencing currents that distribute heat and nutrients across the planet. Warmer waters hold less dissolved oxygen, reinforcing the expansion of low oxygen zones, while also affecting the metabolic rates of organisms that depend on stable conditions. These changes extend into the structure of ecosystems. Species that once occupied certain regions begin to move, following the shifting patterns of temperature and resource availability. Some migrate toward cooler waters, others adjust their depth, seeking conditions that remain within their tolerance. These movements reshape communities, altering interactions that had previously remained consistent. Food chains, which depend on the continuity of these interactions, begin to reflect this variability. The base of the system responds first, with microscopic life adjusting to new conditions, sometimes increasing in certain regions while declining in others. These shifts move upward, affecting the distribution of species that rely on them, and continuing through the layers of the ecosystem. There is a subtle reorganization within this process, where the connections between species become less predictable. Regions that once supported stable populations may fluctuate, and the pathways through which energy moves become less consistent. The ocean continues to sustain life, yet its structure is no longer as evenly balanced as it once appeared. In certain areas, the expansion of low oxygen conditions leads to the formation of environments where only specific organisms can persist. These regions do not remain entirely devoid of life, but they support fewer forms, often those capable of tolerating reduced oxygen levels. Larger, more active species tend to avoid these areas, their presence limited by the constraints imposed by the environment. The parallels to earlier periods emerge through these patterns. Changes in temperature, shifts in oxygen distribution, and the reorganization of ecosystems all reflect processes that have occurred before, though not always at the same scale or rate. The ocean has moved through such transitions in the past, reshaping its structure and the life within it. What remains consistent is the relationship between the system and the forms it supports. As conditions change, the alignment between organism and environment adjusts, favoring those that can persist within the new configuration. The outcome is not immediate, but unfolds over time as the effects of these changes accumulate. Within the present ocean, these signals continue to develop, not as isolated events, but as part of a broader pattern that connects past and present. The surface remains active. The depths continue to hold their quiet stability, yet the underlying structure is shifting, guided by forces that have shaped the ocean before and continue to do so now. Beyond the reach of routine observation, there are vast regions of the ocean that remain largely unexamined, not because they are hidden by design, but because their scale and depth extend beyond what is easily accessed. The surface, with its light and motion, offers only a narrow window into a much larger system, one that continues far below, where conditions differ in ways that are only partially understood. In these deeper regions, the absence of light creates an environment shaped by different rules. Without sunlight, life does not rely on photosynthesis, but on other sources of energy, often derived from the gradual descent of organic material or from chemical processes occurring within the Earth itself. This separation from surface conditions allows for the persistence of systems that operate independently of the cycles that dominate shallower waters. The extent of these environments means that many areas have yet to be directly observed. The technology required to reach such depths is complex, and each exploration reveals only a small portion of what exists. As a result, the ocean remains a space where new forms can still be encountered, not because they have recently appeared, but because they have not yet been seen. Among these unseen forms may be species that reflect lineages extending far into the past. In stable regions, where conditions have changed slowly, organisms can persist with structures that resemble those found in earlier periods of Earth's history. These forms do not represent a return to the past, but a continuation of it, preserved within environments that have remained within certain limits over long spans of time. The conditions in these depths can, in some respects, parallel those that existed in ancient oceans. Temperature gradients, chemical compositions, and the absence of light create settings where life follows patterns that differ from those at the surface. These parallels do not replicate past ecosystems exactly, but they offer insight into how life can exist under a range of conditions that have appeared at different points in Earth's history. Each exploration into these regions contributes to a broader understanding of the ocean as a whole. New species are identified, new interactions are observed, and new questions arise about how these systems function and how they connect to the rest of the marine environment. The process is ongoing, with each discovery adding to a picture that remains incomplete. There is a quiet continuity in this ongoing exploration, where the unknown is not a barrier, but a space that continues to hold information about the diversity and adaptability of life. The ocean does not reveal itself all at once, and what remains unseen continues to influence what is known, shaping our understanding of how life persists across different conditions. Within these depths, the ocean maintains a complexity that extends beyond immediate observation, holding systems that operate on scales and in ways that are only gradually being understood. The presence of unknown species, the persistence of ancient traits, and the continuation of discovery all point to a system that is far from fully revealed. And in that vastness, where light does not reach and observation is limited, the ocean continues to hold forms and processes that connect the present to distant pasts, offering a reminder that much of its story remains beyond what has yet been brought into view. Fragments are often all that remain, not entire systems, not complete sequences, but scattered traces that hint at structures once whole. In the ocean's history, these fragments take the form of bones, impressions, mineralized outlines, each preserved under specific conditions, each carrying only a portion of a larger narrative. What they reveal is significant, yet what they leave out is equally present, shaping the boundaries of what can be known. The fossil record does not unfold as a continuous account. It is selective, shaped by the environments that allow preservation and by the processes that follow. Soft-bodied organisms rarely leave clear traces, and even more durable forms may be lost through erosion, subduction, or the slow transformation of the Earth's crust. Entire ecosystems may pass without leaving a detailed record, their presence inferred only through indirect evidence. Because of this, the causes behind many extinction events remain subjects of ongoing study. Multiple factors often intersect: climate shifts, changes in ocean chemistry, alterations in circulation, each contributing in ways that are difficult to isolate. The sequence of events may be reconstructed through patterns observed across different regions, yet these reconstructions carry uncertainty, shaped by the limits of available evidence. In some cases, chemical signatures preserved in ancient sediments provide insight into past conditions, indicating variations in oxygen levels or the presence of compounds associated with environmental stress. These signals offer a glimpse into processes that operated on a global scale, yet they do not always align neatly with the biological record, leaving room for interpretation. Ocean systems themselves add another layer of complexity. They are not uniform environments, but interconnected networks of currents, temperature gradients, and chemical distributions. Changes in one part of the system can influence distant regions, creating effects that are not immediately visible in localized records. This interconnectedness makes it challenging to trace cause and effect with precision. The movement of continents, the shifting of sea levels, and the reorganization of currents all contribute to these patterns, altering the pathways through which energy and nutrients flow. Each of these processes operates over different timescales, sometimes overlapping, sometimes reinforcing or counteracting one another. The result is a system where multiple variables interact continuously, shaping outcomes that cannot be attributed to a single source. As new methods of analysis develop, additional layers of information become accessible. Isotopic studies, advanced imaging techniques, and refined dating methods allow for more detailed examination of existing evidence. Each advancement adds clarity, yet also reveals further complexity, highlighting connections that were not previously visible. There is a gradual expansion of understanding within this process, where the picture becomes more detailed without becoming entirely complete. Each discovery adjusts previous interpretations, refining the narrative rather than finalizing it. The ocean's history, preserved in fragments and patterns, remains open to revision as new evidence emerges. This ongoing investigation reflects the nature of the system itself. Just as the ocean operates through continuous interaction, the effort to understand it progresses through the integration of multiple lines of evidence. No single perspective provides a complete view, and the synthesis of information becomes essential to approaching a broader understanding. Within this evolving framework, the story of the ocean remains partially obscured, not hidden entirely, but layered, requiring careful reconstruction. The fragments that exist offer insight into what has occurred, while also indicating the extent of what remains unknown. And in this space between what is known and what is still being uncovered, the ocean continues to hold its history, not as a fixed account, but as a dynamic record, gradually revealed through the steady accumulation of evidence and the continued effort to understand it. Nothing in the ocean remains fixed for long, even when it appears settled. Beneath the surface, processes continue to unfold, shaping and reshaping the structure of life in ways that extend far beyond a single generation. What seems stable at one moment is part of a larger sequence, one that moves through phases of growth, expansion, and eventual decline, only to begin again in a different form. Ecosystems emerge through the gradual alignment of conditions. Temperature, chemistry, and the flow of nutrients come together in ways that allow life to organize itself into interconnected systems. At first, these systems are simple, composed of organisms that establish the foundation upon which others depend. Over time, complexity increases as new relationships form and additional layers of interaction develop. As these systems grow, they reach a point where their structure becomes highly interconnected. Energy flows through multiple pathways, linking species in intricate networks that support a wide range of life. In these moments, the ocean can sustain forms that require stable conditions and consistent access to resources. The system appears balanced, its components aligned in a way that allows for continuity. Yet this balance is not permanent. The same forces that allow ecosystems to form continue to operate, gradually altering the conditions that support them. Shifts in temperature, changes in ocean chemistry, and variations in circulation begin to influence the system. sometimes subtly at first, then with increasing effect. These changes do not immediately dismantle what exists, but they introduce variation into patterns that once held steady. As variation increases, the connections within the ecosystem begin to adjust. Some species adapt, modifying their behavior or distribution to align with new conditions. Others find themselves less suited to the changing environment, their presence becoming less stable. The system continues to function, but its structure begins to shift, moving away from its previous state. In certain periods, these shifts accelerate, leading to broader transformations. The interconnected nature of the system allows changes to propagate, affecting multiple levels simultaneously. What begins at one point can extend through the network, altering relationships across the ecosystem. In these moments, the system may no longer sustain the forms that once defined it. Extinction within this process is not an isolated event, but part of a larger transition. As conditions move beyond the range that certain species can tolerate, they disappear, leaving spaces within the system that were once occupied. These absences do not remain empty indefinitely. Other forms, better aligned with the new conditions, begin to emerge or expand, gradually filling the roles that have become available. Evolution continues through this cycle, not in a linear progression, but through adaptation to changing environments. New traits arise, shaped by the conditions that follow each transformation. Over time, these traits define new species, contributing to the formation of ecosystems that differ from those that came before. There is a continuity in this cycle, where growth and collapse are not opposing states, but connected phases of a single process. Each transition carries forward elements of what existed previously, even as it introduces new structures and relationships. The ocean does not reset entirely, but it reorganizes, maintaining a thread of continuity through change. Within this ongoing movement, life persists, not by resisting change, but by responding to it. The forms that endure are those that align with the current state of the system, while those that cannot adjust become part of its history. And through this sequence, repeated across immense spans of time, the ocean continues to transform, its ecosystems rising, shifting, and reforming, guided by processes that ensure it is never truly the same, yet never entirely separate from what it once was. At no point does the ocean hold a final form, no lasting arrangement that remains untouched by what follows. Its surface may seem familiar, its rhythms steady, yet beneath that continuity lies a deeper pattern, one that moves through time without pause, reshaping the life it carries in ways that leave little trace of what once stood at the highest point. The creatures that rise within this system do so under conditions that allow them to expand, to occupy roles that define their era. Their bodies reflect precision, shaped by pressures that refine them into forms capable of moving through their environment with efficiency and strength. For a time, these forms appear complete, aligned with the structure of the world around them. But that alignment does not persist indefinitely. The ocean continues to change, guided by forces that extend beyond the presence of any single species. Temperature, chemistry, circulation, each moves according to processes that do not account for the needs of those that depend on them. As these elements shift, the conditions that once supported dominance begin to alter, sometimes gradually, sometimes with increasing momentum. The creatures at the top remain as they were, their strength unchanged, yet the system that sustained them no longer offers the same continuity. Pathways of energy become less reliable, the distribution of resources less predictable. What once supported their presence begins to move beyond their reach, not through direct confrontation, but through quiet transformation. There is no single moment that defines this transition. It unfolds across time through a series of adjustments that accumulate until the structure that once held steady can no longer do so. The dominant forms do not fade through visible struggle, but through the absence of conditions that once allowed them to exist. Their presence diminishes, not because they have lost their capability, but because the world around them has shifted beyond what they can sustain. In their absence, the ocean does not remain empty. Other forms, smaller, more adaptable, begin to occupy the spaces that have been left behind. These forms do not replicate what came before, but establish new arrangements aligned with the conditions that now define the system. Over time, these arrangements grow, forming ecosystems that reflect the current state of the ocean. This process repeats across vast spans, each cycle carrying forward elements of the past while introducing new structures that replace what has been lost. The ocean does not preserve its dominant forms as permanent features. Instead, it moves through sequences where rise and disappearance are part of the same continuous motion. There is a quiet finality in this pattern, not as an ending, but as a transition that occurs without pause. What once moved with authority through its environment becomes part of the record held in fragments, impressions that hint at its presence without restoring it. The absence is complete, yet the system continues, reshaped by what remains. Within this continuity, survival takes on a different meaning. It is not defined by permanence, but by the ability to exist within a moment that is always passing into another. The ocean does not offer stability in the sense of permanence, but in the persistence of change itself, a steady transformation that guides the forms within it. And so, the highest forms, those that once defined their time, pass into silence, not through failure, but through the progression of a system that does not hold any single form in place. Beneath the surface, far from immediate view, this progression continues, carrying forward the movement of life as it reshapes itself again and again, leaving behind only the traces of what once ruled.